Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Taylor from LSE Live, and I'm going to talk to you about how to write essays that LSE markers want to read. You're going to do some activities during this session, so make sure you download the worksheet from the Moodle page. The plan for this session is first to have a look at some common weaknesses in essays. Then we're going to examine the difference between description and critical analysis. We'll spend a bit of time on this and we'll look at a couple of examples to help you understand. Then I'll have a look at essay structure and how to develop an argument effectively. And finally, we'll have a quick look at assessment criteria and how they can help you with your essay writing. Let's look at a couple of quotations from student handbooks to give you a general view of what academic essays are all about. So the first quote is from the Geography and Environment Handbook, and they say the point of an academic essay is to discuss the complexity of a question, develop an argument, and ideally contribute to the debate on a particular topic. I've highlighted the three key elements here. The first one is complexity. You want to look at something in depth, not take a superficial look at something. The second key point is perhaps the most important, and that is to develop an argument. You're not just going to describe what theorists have said, but you're going to make an argument in response to the essay question or topic that you've been given. And finally, contribute to the debate. Ideally, you want to add something to the discussion that's ongoing about this particular topic. In the second quotation, this one from the International Development Students Guide, says, remember that in the subjects we deal with, and here where they say we, they mean the social sciences as well as international development. In the subjects we deal with, there are no absolutely right or wrong answers to questions as in mathematics or physics. There are better or worse argued points of view. And again, I've highlighted the important part here, which relates to essays, is that there isn't a right or wrong response to your essay question. However, there are well-argued points of view and less well-argued points of view. So your aim is to argue your point of view as effectively as possible. Let's do our first task now. Can you pause this presentation and take a minute to do this task? Have a look at the sentences or the phrases. These are common weaknesses that we've noticed in student essays, or that students often get in their feedback as comments on the less well-developed parts of their essays. See if you can fill in the missing words. So take a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll discuss the answers. Okay, welcome back. Let's have a look at the answers to this task. A says not fully answering the question, and this is something that probably you've been hearing about since you were at school. Quite frequently, students don't fully answer the question, particularly during exams. There may be a number of reasons for this. In exams, it's often because of stress and not reading the question very carefully, or not being able to answer the question and instead answering what the student does know about. Sometimes it's because the essay question has two different parts and the student forgets to complete the second part, or sometimes the student gets distracted by another argument or another interesting piece of information and goes off topic. It's really important that you stick to your essay question and answer it directly, as this is one of the key things that your markers will be looking for. Second common weakness is slipping into a chronological narrative. This is related to just describing things, particularly things as they happen. So this author said this, and then this author said this, or something happened and then something else happened. There may be scope for this kind of narrative in some parts of your essay, but it shouldn't form the main body of your essay. The main point of your essay is to make an argument, not to construct a narrative. C says giving a point of view but providing little or no evidence. So it's important to make arguments to give your point of view, but you also need to evidence your arguments. So you need to draw on your sources to provide evidence for your arguments. D says listing of facts and dates without argument or analysis. This is probably the most common negative comment I see on student essays, something to the effect of too descriptive or not critical enough. It's really important that you engage with your facts, that you engage with your theories, and that you do make an argument and that you do analyze the things that have been written, rather than just describing what your sources say. E is overgeneralizing. This is easily done. You could take a couple of pieces of information from literature, from empirical studies, and overgeneralize them by saying things like all people do this or most people do this from those particular studies or from your own arguments. So be careful not to overgeneralize in your arguments. F is about sources, not using sources accurately, and there are a number of ways in which you can use sources inaccurately. Might be something simple like forgetting a page number when you're quoting somebody. It might be something more serious, such as citing the wrong name, the wrong author name next to some information, or more seriously, forgetting your quotation marks and copying something and presenting it as if it's your own words. So do make sure you use your sources carefully and accurately, and you know how to cite and reference your sources appropriately. G is about organization, and there's two aspects to organization here when I talk about poor organization. One is the overall structure of your essay, so you should have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, and clear body paragraphs, and I'll talk about this a bit more later. The other aspect of organization is about linking your ideas within your paragraphs and making sure that your argument flows from one idea to the next. H is about your evidence, your use of sources. Another very common mistake is to kind of list evidence, so you kind of rely on your sources instead of your arguments. So you sort of say Smith says this, and Jones says this, and Michael says this, without pulling together those ideas to support your argument. So your aim is to synthesize your evidence rather than to list it, and to use that evidence to support your argument rather than listing arguments from other sources and then responding to them. And the final common weakness is an unclear thesis. Your thesis is your main argument, and this is usually communicated to your reader through what we call a thesis statement. A thesis statement is usually one sentence long, but it can be longer. And it's usually the last sentence or one of the last sentences in your introduction, and it should make a clear, direct argument so the reader can see exactly what your essay sets out to do. I said that your course essays need to be analytical and critical, and here's a quote from the MSc Government Handbook that supports that. Let's have a look at what they say. They say your course essays need to have a central integrating argument. Okay, we've said that you need an argument. The argument should be logically developed, and that's related to your organization, your structure. Build up a case point by point and display a critical and analytical approach to the subject. However, sometimes students get a bit confused about what this means in practice. So let's have a look at those three words: descriptive, analytical, and critical. Descriptive is probably the easiest. If you're describing, you're just saying what something looks like or what something does, for example. Analysis is more about looking at something very carefully, pulling it apart, and trying to understand it, and then conveying your interpretation of what you think it means. And then being critical, sometimes students mistake this word, because critical can have a meaning of just criticizing something, saying negative things about it. But here in essays, we're talking about critical thinking. which means being evaluative, evaluating things, which is not just about negative things, but also strengths of a particular argument or point or theory. So you're looking at the strengths and weaknesses of something in order to be critical. Let's have a look at our next task. Have a look on your worksheet at task 2. There are some descriptions there of types of writing. Could you have a look through and just write a D next to the ones you think are descriptive and an A/C next to the ones you think are analytical or critical? So pause this presentation, do that task, and then we'll talk about them when you come back. Hi, welcome back. Those phrases I gave you on your worksheet to decide if they were descriptive or critical are listed here, and you'll see that I just took them from this chart which I got from Stella Cottrell's book. And the aim of the chart is just to compare these two different types of writing to make it a bit clearer as to what the expectation is. So I'll look at a couple of examples and you can look at the rest in your own time. Let's have a look at the first one. Descriptive writing is when you state what happened, whereas critical or analytical writing identifies the significance of that event. So you can see the difference here. Describing is just saying this happened, that happened, whereas a critical or analytical approach would say why this event is important. The second one states what something is like in terms of what it looks like or how it behaves. And if you want to be more critical or analytical, you might evaluate the strengths or weaknesses of that thing. A bit lower down it says descriptive writing explains what a theory says, whereas critical or analytical writing will show why the theory is relevant. So you can get an idea from these different ways of looking at the two types of writing of what's expected of you. So do have a read through those. Let's move on to another example now. Have a look at this exercise on your worksheet. The same paragraph appears on your worksheet. I want you to read through and decide if you think this paragraph is mostly descriptive or mostly critical and analytical. I would suggest that you underline phrases as you're going to help you decide if you think it's mostly descriptive or mostly critical. This paragraph comes from a student essay, but it has been used with the student's permission. Welcome back. Let's have a look at that task. I hope that you decided that the paragraph was mostly descriptive. If you have a look at the student's use of sources, you'll see they're quite descriptive. So concept proposed by Foucault, blah, blah. Foucault argues that. The first one is, the second one is. It's just describing theories from Foucault. Later on in the paragraph, it's a little bit more critical in the sense that it uses Foucault's argument to make a thesis statement, so to make an argument of the essays as a whole. So the student says, in this essay, we'll focus on biopower that affects the discipline of body. Biopower controls life explicitly by fostering knowledge so that individuals in that society have self-discipline. So the students used the theory to put forward this argument. It does still sound a little bit descriptive, though, even in the argument part that could have been more clearly conveyed. So is this a problem or not? The answer to that question is it depends. You will frequently have descriptive paragraphs in your essays. It's quite common to have a descriptive paragraph or two where you lay out a theory or an argument or an idea before you engage with it. This looks like the student's introduction to the essay, and again, that is a paragraph that may have some description where it lays out the theories that are going to be discussed. Though, as I said, the thesis statement should make a direct argument and be critical. So this isn't necessarily a problem if the student does go on to critically engage much more with these arguments. Let's have a look at one more task now. This one will take you a bit longer. On your worksheet, there's a section, this is section 2 from Jackson's text about the well-being dividend. Have a look through this text and underline examples of critical or analytical writing that you can see. Can I also ask you to just pay attention to the structure of this text, because I'll be discussing that a bit more later. So how does the writer construct his arguments? So pause the presentation now and spend some time looking through that text and underlining examples of critical and analytical writing, and also trying to figure out how the argument is developed. Let's have a look at this text and analyze how the author has constructed his argument and how he's used critical or analytical language. I won't go through every detail of the text, but I will pull out some examples to show you what I mean. So what you can see on the screen at the moment is the first paragraph of this text. And you probably didn't highlight any critical or analytical language in there because this is quite a descriptive paragraph. And this is quite common in academic writing, to set out, to explain how a model works before you start to interact with the model or with the arguments, before you start to analyze it. So here the author just introduces this model of pursuing human well-being that he believes modern society is organized around. So he just sets out what he believes the main principles of this model to be. We could certainly argue that this is analytical in a sense, because the author has read about these ideas and this is his interpretation of it. But the way it's presented here is fairly descriptive. Let's have a look at some further paragraphs. So this is the next paragraph in the text, and here you'll see the writing becomes a little more analytical and critical. So the first line says, on the face of it, this model appears to make sense. So appears to make sense is a fairly positive comment. It's an evaluative comment, and it seems to be quite positive. However, the author has added a sort of interpretive feeling about it, and a feeling of that this is just superficially, it makes sense. So there's a suggestion that later he's going to criticize it, saying things like on the face of it and it appears to make sense suggests that it doesn't necessarily make sense if you look a bit deeper. However, the language here is fairly analytical. He's basically setting out his analysis of the model. In this paragraph, similar things are going on. So he's still saying appears to be important. So he's presenting positive things about the model, but distancing himself a bit by saying appears to be. Another strategy he uses to distance himself from these positive arguments is using phrases that I've highlighted in green here, like it has been argued or it is argued. So the passive voice here indicates that some people have made these arguments, but there's an underlying feeling that he might not agree with these people and that he might be setting up these arguments in order to be more critical about them later. Similar thing is going on here. So he engages with the literature, he's being a bit critical about it, but you can see quite a lot of this language. Some have argued, according to a view, welfare economists moderated this view, levels of inequality are supposed to level off, income growth is seen as a panacea. So all of these phrases indicate that he's talking about other people's opinions, and he seems to be distancing himself from those opinions, even though he's setting up this model in a relatively positive way. He's definitely saying this is what other people say about the model. And in this section is where the author starts to critically engage with the ideas from this model. You can see in the very first sentence, the argument falls apart in several ways. So you can see he's going to begin to take the argument apart and to comment on its weaknesses. One weakness he's highlighted here is there's virtually no evidence in support of Kuznets' hypothesis. That's a very common way to, or a very common way to highlight weaknesses in an argument or in research, by saying there's no evidence or information is missing. And then the bit I've highlighted in blue is the author's own evidence to evidence the argument that he is making. And if you have a look through the other highlighted parts, they clearly show the author is highlighting weaknesses of this model that he has previously discussed. So things like assumptions about technological efficiency are unlikely to deliver this level of per capita emissions, slowing, if we're not either to live in a grossly unequitable world or else vastly exceed climate change limits. So the language that he's using clearly shows he is critically engaging with the ideas. I'll talk in a minute about how he set that argument up, but let's talk about essay structure as a whole right now. So there's a quote here from the Geography and Environment Handbook. Some good advice there. It says a good academic essay consists of 3 parts: relatively short introduction, a substantial discussion section, and a conclusion. So your discussion section is the body of your essay, your body paragraphs. So let's have a look at what's expected in each of those sessions. So in your introduction, you would commonly find these main features in this order usually. So usually we start by introducing the context in which the debate or the issue is being discussed. This then leads on to the debate, the issue that you are discussing in your essay. And then your thesis and your outline might occur in that order, or you might have your outline first and then your thesis, or you might do them all together in one sentence. Your thesis statement is your statement of the argument, your response to the essay question and what you're going to argue in the essay. Your outline is your plan, how you're going to organize your essay. So you might say this essay will first do X, then it will do Y, and finally it will do Z. Your introduction should be about 10% of the length of your essay. Don't let it get much longer than this, because then you're taking away from your word count in the rest of your essay, where you want to develop your argument in more detail. So the main body of your essay, and make sure you mark your paragraphs clearly with a clear line in between each paragraph, or indenting a clear indentation at the beginning of each paragraph. Now the aim of your paragraphs are to develop the argument that you outlined in your thesis statement. So each paragraph should have one sub-argument or one argument that supports your main argument. And these should all build up and create a line of reasoning across your paragraphs. So you want to make sure that the arguments connect and flow from one to the other. And then finally, your essay will end with a concluding paragraph. Again, this shouldn't be too long. About 10% of your essay is plenty. The main purpose of the conclusion is to pull together your arguments and remind your reader of the main points that you're making. So the key thing you need to do here is summarize your main arguments from the body of your essay. Don't include new arguments, don't include new examples. You're just repeating, summarizing the main arguments of your essays, of your whole essay. And of course, don't forget you need a reference list at the end of your essay as well. How you develop your argument in the main body of your essay will vary depending on your essay question, and you need to think very carefully about your essay question, about the arguments you want to make, and then about the best way to structure your argument to fulfill that task. Let's have a look though at the argument that we used in, that we saw in the text that you've just read. So remember, this isn't an essay, it's just one section from a whole academic paper. But it is one possible way that you could arrange your arguments in your essay. So if you recall what the author does in this argument, the first paragraph set up this model of well-being that he's going to interrogate. And that's a very common way to begin things, to set up your context, what's happening, what's the situation. And then in the next few paragraphs, he talks about this model, this development model A, and why it seems to work, what's important about the model, and the fact that there's some evidence to support the model. So he's setting up one side of this argument, and if you recall, he spends quite a lot of time citing other sources and pointing to the fact that this is what other people argue. Then in the next few paragraphs, we look at the author's argument. So here is where he critically engages with this model and presents the flaw in the arguments supporting the model, and talking about problems with those arguments. And he also provides a specific example to support his arguments. And then finally, in a very brief final paragraph, it's only one sentence, he makes his main argument, his conclusions. This is a sort of different way, not a different way, this is one way of organizing a section or a paragraph, but he basically pulls together all of those arguments and then says, therefore, we need to be careful when we look at seeing well-being in this particular way. You can do the same kind of thing. He's done this over a number of paragraphs in a complete section of his paper. You can do a similar thing within one paragraph of your essay. You can look at one specific detailed topic, talk about what some people say about it, why they think it's a good thing, then critique it yourself, and then come up with your topic sentence, your main argument at the end of the paragraph. Or you might do things the other way around. You might start your paragraph with your topic sentence, which is your main argument, and then explain why it's your main argument and support that with evidence. So there are many different ways of developing your argument. So you want to think quite carefully about that as you're writing. So just to summarize some key issues about structure, as I said, you want to make sure you develop your argument or your line of reasoning across your paragraph. So make sure things link up and develop throughout your essay. It's quite easy when we're writing, because things are clear in our own minds, to think that they're clear on the paper. So you want to try to distance yourself from your writing, try to look at it as if you're somebody else, and check that your argument is being clearly explained and developed through your essay. The second thing we mentioned earlier is to make connections rather than just listing information from sources. So you want to synthesize all of your ideas rather than just saying Smith says this, Jones says this, Michaels says this, for example. You want to pull the ideas together to either support or be critiqued by your own argument. Related to that critiquing is, don't forget to include other sides of the argument. This is very good academic practice. It may be tempting to ignore sources that say something different from your view. But in academic writing, we actually do the opposite. We make sure we don't pretend that opposing ideas don't exist. We introduce them in our writing and say why we don't support those opposing ideas. So we offer counter arguments to those opposing ideas. You don't have to offer counter arguments to every single opposing idea out there, but if there are big controversies or opposing arguments within your field, you do need to engage with both sides and then take a position on one side or the other. Also think about what structure makes sense for your question. So this is key. And also, what does the reader need to know before they know something else? So remember, you need to lead them step by step. Make sure they understand what you're talking about. So you want to think about what makes more sense, either giving some evidence and then using this evidence to make your claim or your argument, or making your argument and then using the evidence to support that argument. So you need to think about your question and what your reader needs to know in making that decision. The structure depends on your essay question, as I've just said, and this example that we've looked at is only one way of doing it. So think about alternative ways of organizing your arguments and choose the clearest and the most logical for your question. Let's have a look now at assessment criteria. It's very important that you look at the assessment criteria that your department have provided, just to give you an idea of what's expected at various grade levels to help you write the essay that you've been assigned and to help you get the grade that you want to get. So this is just an example from the Department of Social Policy. This is for the MSc programs. So the pass mark is at 50%, and you will see at the bare pass level, you're looking at a fairly descriptive essay, not much critical engagement. The student would only be engaging with the key, the main texts from the course, and the argument wouldn't be developed to a very a deep or sophisticated level. However, if you want to get a merit or a distinction, then the criteria are asking for a much better developed argument in terms of structure, use of a range of literature, including sometimes literature outside of your reading list, a very good understanding of the key theories and arguments, and good critical engagement with those arguments. And the mark that you're going to get, be it a merit or distinction, will depend on the extent to which you're able to demonstrate those things. And at distinction level, you want to be showing a little bit of originality of thought, that you're not just agreeing with other people's arguments, but that you might have your own arguments as well that you can present. So do look very carefully at your assessment criteria before you begin writing your essays. I'm going to finish by summarizing the main points of this presentation. So just to highlight the type of essays that LSE markers want to read. So number one, they want to read essays that discuss the complexity of an issue. So they want you to look at things in depth, not just superficially. And they also want to see an argument developed. So you need to take a position, you need to make an argument about the issue under discussion. Number two, they want you to clearly answer the question. So pay very careful attention to your essay question and make sure you're addressing it. Also note what we said about the beginning, that there isn't a correct answer to essay questions, that there's either a well-argued essay or a badly argued essay. And therefore, it depends is a perfectly valid answer to an essay question. So for example, if your question said, is theory an effective theory for evaluating poverty, for example, you might say, it depends. in the context of one country, for example, Peru, this theory is very useful in shedding light on the reasons for poverty. However, if we look at a different context, for example, the UK, the theory doesn't seem to be an effective way of evaluating the reasons for poverty. So it depends is a perfectly valid answer as long as you set out your reasons clearly and carefully. They also want to read essays that analyze and evaluate rather than just describing. So be careful that you don't end up in this kind of chronological descriptive way of thinking when you're using your sources and you're just describing what they say. You want to make sure that your voice is clear in your essay and your readers can see that you were there and that you were making an argument. Related to this is number 4, you need to demonstrate critical thinking. So you need to show that you can look at the theories and the arguments that you've been reading about, and you can evaluate whether you think they're effective or any weaknesses that you can see in them, and explain why you think either case. Number 5, related to that as well, is your essays need to be evidence-based. So you want to make an argument, but you want to make sure you provide evidence for your arguments as well, in order to strengthen them. Number 6, your essays need to have a clear thesis. So your argument needs to be clearly expressed. The best way to do this is with a clear thesis statement in your introduction that clearly makes your argument, and then topic sentences in each paragraph that clearly state the sub-arguments of each paragraph. Number 7, your essays need to be accurately referenced. This refers to making sure that you cite all sources that you use, making sure that you paraphrase the information thoroughly, or that you use quotation marks if you do copy words from sources, that you follow a style guide to make sure that you are citing accurately and writing your reference list accurately. Number 8, they want to read well-structured essays that are easy to follow. So this involves your overall structure, your introduction, body, paragraphs, and conclusion, but also making sure those ideas flow and are linked throughout your paragraphs. Number 9, they want your essays to meet the departmental criteria. So pay attention to those criteria and make sure you're doing what your departments ask you to do in your essays. And finally, if you want to get a good mark, you want to make sure you're trying to contribute to the debate on a particular topic. So some sort of originality in your ideas or a different way of looking at things. If you want further help with your essay writing, do have a look at the LSE Live events page and keep an eye out for other workshops that we might be running. Look at our materials on Moodle. We've got lots and lots of materials in Moodle which you may find helpful, so do go and have a look through those. And you can also book a one-to-one session with an LSE Live study advisor to talk through your essay writing.